Good afternoon.
Hey, Tim.
How are you?
Good. Top of the morning to you.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you.
Yeah, likewise. I was just working my way through your Toxins as Tools article. Very cool stuff. I had not seen that before.
Yeah, I sent it to you a little bit late, 5 minutes before we start recording, but
Yeah, it's great though. I made my way maybe halfway through it, and it's great because I was hoping to throw a couple of books into the mix. You've probably heard of these. Plants and the Human Brain by David Kennedy.
I don't know that one.
Oh, that's a good one. And then Darwin's Pharmacy, Sex, Plants, and the Evolution of the Noosphere by Richard Doyle. You know that one?
That one I do know, yes.
Yeah. In Darwin's Pharmacy is a bit more written for a popular audience. David Kennedy's book is accessible, but more of a scientific treatment. But the idea of toxins as functional ecomolecules, as you put it, is very much at the center of what Kennedy is doing.
Okay, I'll need to check that out then. I'm embarrassed that I don't know it, actually.
So many books. No worries. It's not a moral failing to not be able to keep up with the knowledge economy these days.
Indeed.
But yeah, why don't we just start with your article? I like the frame toxins as tools, and trying to take an evolutionary perspective on the human being, cutting us down to size a bit, emphasizing the continuity between the rest of the animal kingdom and us. We're not the only tool users, but this idea of molecules themselves as tools is really interesting. Do you want to introduce this idea to us?
Yeah, there are kind of a few ways into it, I suppose. This is our third chat. We haven't really talked about my day job in our previous chats. So I'm a toxinologist. So I work on these functional ecomolecules that we call toxins that plants, animals, fungi, microorganisms, etc., make in order to mediate antagonistic interactions. So toxins are usually for defense or sometimes competitor deterrence, or for offense, and I do a lot of work on venoms. And venoms are, of course, often, not exclusively, but often offensively utilized. So they're utilized in order to secure a meal, for example. But certainly a lot of venoms are also utilized defensively. And things like venoms and poisons, which is the kind of really broad encompassing category, and we can get onto a little note for pedants there. Well, might as well go there right now. You'll often see online, if you're in these sorts of communities, people saying, "Oh, snakes aren't poisonous; they're venomous," and feeling a little bit intelligent for knowing that. Sorry to burst the bubble of those pedants, but poison is a very general term, and venom is a specific kind of poison. In biological context, we normally say, though, that poisons are passively delivered. So things that are absorbed across the skin or mucous membranes or ingested. So a lot of poisonous animals, their poisons are defensive. So if another animal tries to eat them or whatever, it can poison them. Where we say venoms are that subset of poisons which are actively delivered. So like through a bite or a sting or whatever. So snakes are venomous in this more specific sense. Some snakes are, but some are also poisonous to ingest as well. And that's going to be part of this story about toxins as tools, because toxins are out there. Plants are making them, fungi are making them, animals are making them for their own purposes, for a range of purposes. And we could already talk about them as functional traits of the organism, and there's a important conceptual link between just a functional trait and a tool, in that it's for something, it has a purpose. But where the tool use thing kind of starts to get in there, or where I start to try and build a story about tool use in there, is when one organism sequesters or co-opts the toxins that another organism produces for its own purposes. And this is actually like super common. Classic toxin sequestration is, one animal eats a poisonous animal, for example, is resistant to the toxins that poisonous animal makes, but is not merely resistant to them, actually has ways of acquiring them and preserving them, sequestering them often in specialized tissues, and then using them for its own defensive purposes. And just on the snake thing, to bring that back in, there are snakes that do this. There are snakes that are in fact venomous in the classic sense. They produce their own toxins in specialized venom glands, which they use to secure their prey. Their prey is toads. The toads are poisonous. They have their own, poison glands all over their body, but these particularly huge parotid glands that toads are famous for. The snakes are resistant to the cardiotoxins in the toad poison, and they actually sequester it in specialized neutral glands, their own glands, around their necks, and that makes them poisonous to eat as well. So they've got their own venom, and then they're stealing the toxins from the toads to use as a defensive toxin. And this is where I get into this idea of toxins as tools.
I had no idea that this type of sequestration occurs. This is new for me. That's fascinating.
It's really common. A lot of even some classically poisonous animals that we think of don't necessarily make their own toxins. So, some poisonous butterflies, for example, like the wanderer or monarch butterfly, it gets its toxins from plants it feeds on during the larval phase, while it's a caterpillar, and that later makes it sort of unpalatable or toxic. Poison dart frogs, they don't make their toxins, they get them from their diet. So you can have, keep poison dart frogs in captivity, and they can be completely non-poisonous because they're not eating the ants and some other insects that they're sequestering toxins for. You've got nudibranchs that feed on stinging hydrozoans and actually steal the entire stinging cell, which is a very elaborate, venom delivery mechanism that cnidarians, so jellyfish, corals, hydrozoans, etc., have, and sequester those in their sting. That's something called kleptonidae. There's even a cool bit of jargon for that. But yeah, this is super common. Like a lot of toxins that are out there also start with plants. Plants make these secondary metabolites for their own purposes, maybe defensive, but sometimes we just don't know why plants are making these things. But animals eat them and then often store them for their own uses as well. So,
right, yeah, it's Kennedy's whole book, Plants in the Human Brain, is about these secondary metabolites in plants and the way that plants and insects have co-evolved. And given the way, he's really tracing the way in which, because the human brain is a kind of elaborated version of an insect nervous system, a lot of the metabolic pathways and neurochemical pathways that are associated with our own consciousness actually evolved in this plant-insect relationship over the course of millions of years.
Very cool. I clearly read this book, yeah.
Yeah. And, of course, serotonin is widespread in the animal kingdom, and many plants and fungi seem to produce molecules which are quite similar to serotonin. Psilocybin mushrooms, for example, producing psilocybin. And it seems like what initially was developed by plants to ward off insects eventually became attractive to other insects to pollinate. And as you're saying, it's not always an offense. I mean, it sometimes these ecological or ecomolecules are not offensive or defensive. They're kind of symbiotic, right? And each organism is enhanced by the sharing that can go on.
Absolutely. I mean, toxicity is always a kind of, context dependent property. And I can sort of unpack what that means if necessary, because I also distinguish property from function. Something can be toxic for completely arbitrary or contingent reasons. So something, because it's context dependent in this sense, something that mediates, it could be functionally toxic in a relationship between a plant and one group of organisms could actually be an attractant for another group of organisms. Like this sort of co-evolutionary dynamics can flip in interesting ways. Say one group of insects evolves a kind of resistance to the toxin. Now the plant, this is, giving a very coarse-grained story about how these kinds of things happen, because this is obviously going to be very complex. In a lot of cases, we don't know what's going on. But, if resistance evolves in one group, now the plant is no longer defended from that group, it may need to do something else to encourage a more beneficial or less antagonistic relationship with that group or something. So these things are always potentially, subtly shifting. And you brought up, psilocybin, and maybe we'll talk about that later, but we don't know what that's for. Like why mushrooms are producing this and producing it in obviously serious concentrations in some cases. It has been thought, typical toxinologist mindset, well, this must be a defensive toxin, right? And we can imagine that certainly if large vertebrates or mammals eat that kind of thing, that it could cause a very alarming experience for them, and that might work as a toxin. But tons of insects eat, psilocybe mushrooms. So not sure. We don't know what's going on there, and it could be something completely orthogonal. Like it could be just a signaling molecule. For them, they're using it like we use serotonin, maybe, or something like that. And it just happens that when it's abstracted from that context, very arbitrarily, it has these crazy effects in other nervous systems or in nervous systems that become the basis for this full-on arguably co-evolutionary relationship between, say, primates, us, and mushrooms. But that may not have ever been, on the cards, so to speak, for the mushrooms themselves. And it may not have even been an eco-molecule for them initially, right? Yeah.
And you're being very scientifically careful as a toxinologist in discussing about this. And I want to ask you to put your speculative philosopher cap on, and I want to see how you take this idea that these functional ecomolecules may, over the course of evolutionary time, have become something like a chemical language, and that there's a form of biosemiosis, if you want, going on, where obviously there's a direct physical effect of a toxin that's going to kill an animal that's been bitten by a snake or what have you, but on a subtler level, as we're dealing with something more complicated than just a predator-prey relationship, but some sort of ecological, if not symbiotic relationship, then at least a sort of mutuality of some kind, where organisms are unintentionally creating conditions for other organisms to flourish, that we end up with some kind of a chemical language that is sort of pervasive throughout the plant and animal kingdoms.
Yeah, I think the way I'd respond to that, even as a speculative philosopher, would be to say that these things all blur into each other in the natural world. And so just like I was saying, these kinds of interactions can easily flip from antagonistic to symbiosis is often used colloquially to mean mutualism, which is a specific kind of symbiosis in which both organisms are benefiting from the relationship that they're in. Symbiosis just means living together. So in biology, we also talk about commensalism, which is basically just living alongside each other neutrally, interacting, but no one's really benefiting. And parasitism is actually also a form of symbiosis. And we can go, even further and talk about, ecology in general is kind of, symbiosis. And so these ecomolecules are assuming that they are mediating interactions between organisms of any kind, you can then say, well, that's a kind of communication, right? Even if the communication is, don't eat me, I'm going to make you sick. They are signaling molecules in a way, right? So any defensive toxin is a signaling molecule. So I think we want to impose categories, and we want to think speculatively, and we want to it's really fun to think about, in a Terence McKenna kind of style, the mushrooms are speaking to us, and they're teaching us and all of that sort of thing. And we can go from toxins as tools to toxins as teachers, which, I just like alliteration. So, we can definitely go there. And I think that there's a way of understanding them as teachers, which is totally legitimate, but we don't necessarily have to say that the mushrooms are on board with that per se. Because, what would it mean for a mushroom to be, I don't know, understanding itself or conceptualizing itself as a teacher? It's involved in a communicative relationship, but clearly not. Well, I say clearly not, but I don't see any reason to think it's reflecting on this relationship, or that it's cognitively involved, or whatever would be the right term. Right. It's just that, going back to the toxins as tools thing, like a big thing in evolution is something we call acceptation, right? So acceptation occurs when there's a property, an organism has a property, or anything in the world has a property. It might be something that was selected for a particular purpose, so it might be a functional trait, or it might just be an epiphenomenon of some kind. It just happens to be that way. And then it is co-opted by virtue of having this property. It's co-opted for some other use that then becomes functional. And so I like to think of acceptation in this, classic examples are things like, feathers were originally for thermoregulation for, theropod dinosaurs that were warm-blooded, and, feathers were much like fur. But because feathers are structured in a certain way, this eventually facilitated the evolution of gliding and then flight and whatever. So it's these kinds of chains of adaptation, where adaptation for a particular purpose actually sort of foreshadows adaptation for a subsequent purpose that was never, of course, as evolutionary biologists, we want to remove as much foresight from the way we're conceptualizing these things as possible. So we're like, it arbitrarily, we would say, it was predisposed for no particular reason. And that's as how we get the idea of a transcendent designer out of a system and all of that kind of thing. But this notion of pre-adaptation or acceptation, a term coined to avoid the term pre-adaptation, is super important. And I've generalized that beyond its usual usage to talk about this toxins as tools kind of thing, or just tool use in general. So with classic examples of tool use in the animal kingdom, a capuchin monkey finds a rock that is of a particular shape and weight that makes it good when combined with another rock or a boulder with a flat surface on top. Taken together, these two rocks make a great platform and hammer, or mortar and pestle for cracking nuts. And that's uncontroversially tool use. Yeah, everyone would agree capuchins are using tools. But I talk about it as acceptation, because here are these rocks. These rocks are just minding their own business, and they're not the shape they are for any, most of us would think not for any particular reason, right? They're just arbitrarily in whatever shape they are because of forces that have been acting on them blindly for, very, very long periods of time, blah, blah, blah. But the monkey sees the opportunity in those sorts of things and co-opts these epiphenomena, if you want, which are the shape and weight and all of that of the rocks, and turns them into a functional artifact. And this is quite common in nature. Lots of animals will do this sort of thing. Tool use is fairly common, and it does extend to even shaping the making a stick pointier. A crow will rub a stick and try to shear it into a fine point so that it can use it to extract grubs from a branch or whatever. And so my basic argument is that tool use of that kind is a form of acceptation, It's finding something in your environment that, for no particular reason, is potentially useful. And then I say toxin sequestration is much the same kind of thing. Something in your environment, which is some molecule that another organism is making, not for your purposes, often to repel you, or for completely arbitrary, for reasons that have nothing to do with the other organism. And then that other organism takes them and deploys them for its own purposes. And so that's a kind of acceptation. And I'm making that parallel with tool use there. And then I'm saying that pharmacology, like to make the really, long arc very short, that pharmacology, which, modern humans practice, pharmacology that humans have been practicing for tens of thousands of years, but even the way modern humans practice it is just on an evolutionary series with these kinds of behaviors. But I guess the point being, or how did I get onto this long spiel, is that these interactions can be modified in lots of different ways, including just this, we find something in nature. Maybe the mushrooms are using psilocybin as a signaling molecule for their own purposes. It has nothing to do with us, but we have, perhaps by accident, juicy mushroom in our environment, tried it, had a certain kind of experience. We can go the full Terence McKenna food of the gods. Hypothesis here, we woke up to our consciousness when we ate mushrooms, whatever. It had some kind of, potent impact on us. And then we kind of turned it into a tool or a teacher. We made it functional in a new way by recontextualizing it. So I guess the point being that I'm totally on board with what you were saying about these sorts of relationships, but there are different ways of sort of framing them, I suppose. And some we would say are kind of legitimate, or could be legitimized. Like we could cash out the metaphor of teacher or whatever it is through certain pathways that wouldn't raise too many hackles in the sort of mainstream scientific world. Or we could just, be Terence McKenna.
Sure. Yeah. So evolution has a way of opportunistically falling into functionality, let's say, through acceptations, right? Sure. Falling in the sense that there's not foresight or planning or some kind of design in advance of the discovery of a tool that happens to work for a purpose that a particular organism can exploit it for that wasn't its original design. But when the capuchin makes use of a rock or a stick or a corvid of some kind, I've seen experiments where they can drop stones into a thin sort of water pitcher to raise the water level so they can drink from it. So there's some degree of foresight there, right? Obviously. And in more complex animals, it's easier for us to accept that perhaps than it would be for plants or microorganisms. But, even with bacteria, there's a kind of Lamarckian evolution that takes place when normal food sources aren't available, right? This bacterial colony will kick its the mutations associated with proteins that might digest a new food source get kicked into hyperdrive until they find the right protein to digest the food sources that all are available, right? So there's some degree of this kind of mentalistic, to avoid just saying mind, there's some kind of mind operating here too, right?
Yeah.
And so,
in the same way, sorry to interrupt, but in the same way as with the tool use and everything, we want to situate human mind and cognition on a spectrum, right? So it's not going to be surprising if there are mind-like, processes at work across all of life, right? But sorry. So,
right. There's a continuum here. But to flesh out more where I was going with chemical languages and functional ecomolecules as a kind of chemical language, it seems to me that the biosphere is a kind of semiosphere, and that when we think about mammals or vertebrates, let's just say, it's much easier for us to say, oh, that's an individual. It's a unit. It exists more or less kind of independently of its environment. Of course, with simpler forms of life, there's much more gray area between what's an individual and what's not an individual. A mushroom, for example, is the fruiting body of a mycelial network that it's made of cells. Ultimately, you could say those are individuals, but the cells, each, my cellular component of this mycelial network is fully evolved to exist in the context of that network. And so then when you consider the vertebrate as, not as autonomous and fully individual as we might think, and, just to use the human nervous system as an example here, to what extent is the skin a real barrier? I mean, it's an important barrier for many purposes, immune system, and we have a metabolism, and we do need to maintain some boundary between ourselves and the environment, but it's permeable. But when it comes to our nervous systems, given this coevolutionary history, given the widespread prevalence of neurochemicals in plants and fungi, that, again, like you're saying, they may be using for their own purposes, but a lot of the time they're secondary metabolites and they don't have a clear function, a primary metabolic function for that organism. And so they seem to have something more to do with ecological relationships. And so where I'm going with this is, could we say that the human nervous system is in some sense ecologically extended into the environment?
I mean, I think we would have to say something like that, in that, much of the function of nervous systems is, outwardly directed. So we are using nervous systems in order to, functionally, purposefully remain embedded in our environments in some way, right? And I mean, that's almost a triviality when put that way. I mean, there's so much that you said, and I loved it. And you're talking about, mereological problems in biology. Where are the true individuals? Which is the true organism, or whatever? Where is the cusp between, system and environment, organism and environment? And those are huge problems. And well, huge problems maybe is not the right way of putting it. They can be framed, often you can frame these things quite differently. And, what is the level of analysis that you're going to choose for the particular kind of question that you're asking? Or indeed, what way, the way we chunk up the world, how does that reflect some values that are prior to our and I mean, one of those is the use value, one of those is the pragmatic question. What kind of question am I trying to ask, or what kind of use will I be putting the answers to? So, like, a mutual friend of ours on Twitter, who goes by the handle Euanthes, which I think is true flower, he would say, very rightly, that axiology subtends mereology. So there's always some value judgment that comes before the way we're chunking up the world. Now, I would go back into the organism and my kind of classically evolutionary perspective on the organism, in order to try and it would be speculative, but speculatively account for that axiology. Whereas I think, Euanthes would say that's already a legitimate move, because the axiology will always be presupposed in any judgment you're making. So I'm sort of waffling in because you said so much lovely stuff. I'm just acknowledging that you're absolutely right, that these are real problems. Marking the boundaries of the individual. And I suppose, again, to naturalize it, when we're talking about mammals, we are mammals, like, we have a level at which we understand individuals, which is, very much a product of our evolutionary history and our form of sociality. and the social relationships that we could argue exist between the cells in our bodies. We are, in Michael Levin's terms, collective intelligences. We are, multicellular colonies ourselves. And then we can, of course, we could be talking about bacteria and other things, and we can talk about a kind of facultative multicellularity where in response to certain conditions, they're forming aggregates, whereas at other times they're more individual and that sort of stuff. And, all of these present very, very interesting, conceptual, I'm trying to avoid the term problem, but they're very fertile for analysis. And how do our cells communicate with each other using various, signaling molecules? And, serotonin has come up, but as one of a massive variety of different molecules. How do mushrooms communicate with us if they are indeed doing that with a strikingly similar kind of mode of communication? So there is some interesting notion of an extended individual there. However, it's going to be fairly uncontroversial to say that you and I are related to each other as members of a particular organismal lineage in a way that we're not related to the mushrooms. And so we can do all kinds of mereology that's relatively uncontroversial there, is what I mean,
Mm-hmm. I'm almost partially wanting to recant my earlier problematization of the boundary of the individual, because when I think about axiology preceding or subtending, did you say mereology? It makes me think, well, that makes the valuer the measurer of that distinction, whereas it seems to me there are certain wholes in nature defined by the very perspective and indeed capacity to value that they bring forth. So in other words, a living cell is, I would say, it's a whole with a horizon of experience, or an Umwelt, that has more ontological weight than a molecule composing that cell, in the sense that there's a perspective realized by that whole. And so because this really turns it more into a bit of a loop, like axiology and mereology. It's hard to say where you start, because you need to be yourself a whole, a perceiver, a valuer, before you can then be the valuer to judge, what in your environment is a part or a whole. And there seems to be a capacity among members of a similar species to kind of resonate interior to interior with one another, to recognize one another as wholes. And so it seems more like a circular relationship, or dialectical one perhaps, than just one preceding the other.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that maybe someone pushing this line would say that they wouldn't necessarily use Heidegger, but as thrown, already valuing, value-laden beings, we always as individuals start with, value judgments. The evolutionary question, which I think you're also alluding to, is, how did we become the kinds of beings that make the kinds of value judgments that we make, and not necessarily why do we chunk up the world. I mean, that's, of course, a very interesting question. Why do we chunk up the world in the way that we do? But also, how did we come to be so constituted that we are beings that, need to chunk up the world, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It strikes me, though, that, psilocybin, for example, produces a boundary dissolving experience, an experience of boundary dissolution, wherein it at least appears subjectively that one can become identified with other wholes, rather than just the normal rational waking ego that we typically identify with. One can, people report experiences of becoming one with Gaia, or in the reverse direction, sort of experiencing their cellular consciousness and its multiplicity and unity. And so you can go in either direction, but nonetheless it seems like the whole with which we identify is in some sense malleable. We can move through these levels as a result of
yeah.
I mean, it doesn't just require psychedelic ingestion, but it seems to amplify our capacity to do this sort of thing. And so, it's not as simple as just, the human being is, the human consciousness is simply the whole that emerges from this particular animal body and nervous system. We seem to be capable of sympathetically merging with, wholes or consciousnesses at different levels.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And that can be a very, potent, of course, experience phenomenologically. But when you were saying that, it makes me just think of the kind of pragmatic stance towards levels of description in science. Mm-hmm. And, of course, there's the long-term debate, and I think you and I have discussed it a little bit, about reductionism and what I would refer to as like privileged levels of explanation or privileged levels of description, like saying, well, the really real thing is the atom, and everything else is just a emergent property / illusion or something like that. And then there's a different stance, a more, perspectivalist stance maybe, but a pragmatic stance, which is to say that, well, the important level of description is dictated by whatever kind of, problem we are trying to solve, or what kind of question are we trying to ask? So if we're circling back to kind of broad theme of human relationship with drugs, and we don't need to go deep on this, but if we were talking about, say, addiction, we might be talking about it in terms of it being a mental health disorder that's associated with a particular range of behaviors and experiences of the addicted subject. Or we might be talking about it in terms of a genetic propensity for addictive, behavior, or becoming addicted to certain drugs or whatever it might be. That would be a different level of description. We might be talking about like what happens in terms of, neural networks in an addicted brain or something, like there would be lots of different levels of description we could take these things out. If we were talking about these psilocybin experiences, we could be talking about the phenomenology which you described, this powerful experience of boundary dissolution, or we could be attempting, as many people are these days, to describe this kind of boundary dissolution at the level of information processing in the brain, at the level of neural networks and whatever. And in some sense, that's basically identifying particular wholes, particular levels of description, the cellular level, the molecular level, the neural network level, the organismal behavioral level, or whatever, as most important based on whatever we think it enables us to do, like whatever kind of intervention that might enable, or whatever understanding might be generated from that. So in a sense, I would say this still is this kind of axiology subtending mereology sort of move, in that it's a pragmatic way of approaching things, and rather than saying that this boundary is the level, it's like depends what we're gonna be asking. But I think at the same time, I think we do need to just have some deference to common sense as well, which I think you've also alluded to. And it's an evolved common sense, right? It happens to be the case that for lineages of organisms such as we, that the organismal level and the skin, for example, as boundary is very, very tangible, present, real, and functional to us. I'm having a conversation with another person right now, we could have the experience of some kind of mind melding. I mean, we are having that experience to some degree, to the extent that we're listening to each other and all of that, but we could have it in a very potent way if we were doing psychedelics together or something like that. But that would be fascinating, and that would give us insight into the way these kinds of boundary judgments are made and can be broken down. But at the end of the day, I don't think it would necessarily, well, I guess people react very differently to these things, but it doesn't necessarily break down the common sense judgment that we are still going to be, like, we've realized now, because of this experience that we've had and all the different ways we've analyzed it and whatever, that we're more together or more the same than we ever realized we were before, and that the boundaries between us are relatively malleable, but we would probably still be restored to a state in which, you were Matt and I was Tim. And we would need to be, at least, functionally, pragmatically, we would still need to function in that way, for all sorts of contingent historical reasons as well. And we could decry those. We could say, well, why, for legal reasons, do you have to be Matt and I have to be, or whatever. It's all just convention, we might say. But then, to go way into the deep end, evolution is all just convention. Evolution is all, habit taking. It's conventions all the way down, all the way to the laws of physics kind of thing, if we're doing that kind of hierarchy. Some conventions seem more arbitrary than others. Some are more ephemeral than others. But on some level, we're talking about this layer cake of conventions or habits or, frozen accidents or something like that, taking the evolutionary perspective. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, there's an important evolutionary pressure for me to identify with my body and you to identify with yours, to avoid predators and to find prey and mates and so on. Like there's a reason why we would tend to feel like skin encapsulated egos, right? Biological reasons. And then of course, we can point to different cultural reasons too, that are not separate from those biological reasons. But at the same time, it seems there's a lot of room for play here. As you were speaking, I was thinking of that C.S. Peirce, Charles Saunders Peirce line. I have no idea where he said this, but he says, when I communicate my thoughts and my sentiments to a friend with whom I am in full sympathy, so that my feelings pass into him and I am conscious of what he feels, do I not live in his brain as well as in my own, most literally? And I think that sense of the non-locality of our consciousness can really be, it's brought home in the psychedelic state, because all of a sudden your functional need to do all the things that survival might require kind of it goes offline, and you're able to freely explore consciousness in a way that's not tied to that inherited survival instinct.
And don't we have the capacity to do that because we're social organisms where, we could ritualize this setting and we could have other members of the group protecting us, so to speak, shielding us from all of those basic, set and setting. You don't want to be in a survivalist setting when you are on psychedelics, basically, so we have the capacity to explore those sorts of states for other, evolutionary reasons, perhaps. And that could, again, take us back to the idea that could be a defensive toxin. But contextually, so for a solitary, fungi eating mammal, this could be a very, very dangerous state to be in, where boundaries are dissolving and it can't tell where it begins. And, it's probably just going to be lying down in terrible fear and maybe, I don't want to predict too much, but we can imagine that this is a non-functional state that the organism is being put into, or a pathological state, we might say, and it might be very, very vulnerable then to predation, or just walking off a precipice that it doesn't notice or something like that. But shift the context to this highly social primates that have all sorts of buffers between them and the vagaries of the environment, a species for which niche construction is the primary niche, like us, and suddenly what was pathology inducing, or what was maybe a defensive toxin, again, I'm not saying that it is, this is very speculative, but now we're able to find some function from that, and we're able to do this play that
Right.
you say, we're able to see how breaking these boundaries down and gaining novel perspectives that we access when our normal habitual pathways, our normal habitual categories, and all of that kind of stuff are eroded a little bit. That can enable, the discovery of novel insights, and that can be very functional. And yeah.
I mean, just as another example of the subtle, but me, I think pervasive role of mind, mentality in evolution is, I mean, play, I think, is a great example of how something non-functional, in the sense that it's a sort of offline behavior that, if not done in a protected environment, could be very dangerous for the organism. And you see play across the animal kingdom, but it's especially present in mammals and in primates because I would say of the extended parental care involved in raising a primate and a human being. We're born, I mean, because of neoteny, right? We're born premature relative to apes, and there's an even longer period of parental care. I know you're a parent, like until a kid's 18, like they're really your responsibility.
I'm just assuming for the rest of my life. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so that relaxed field created by extended parental care affords this offline behavior, offline of the normal evolutionary survival thing, where play can be engaged in as an end in itself. And it's a kind of exploratory adventure where new behaviors can be developed. Culture can arise, right? And the capacity for shared attention and shared intention as you learn to play with others. A sense of fairness. You like, when a big dog plays with a little dog, the big dog knows, I got to go easy on this guy or it's not going to be fun. What?
Hopefully it's
Hopefully.
the kind of,
well, if they're good at playing, yeah,
for sure.
But you see this in non-human animals all the time when they're playing, that there's a sense of what's fair play and what's not, and the difference between an actual bite and a nip. And a lot of Gregory Bateson writes really wonderful stuff on this. So play becomes a, as you get to mammals and primates and human beings, evolution sort of, falls into a situation where this form of behavior that's not immediately relevant to survival all of a sudden creates these breakthroughs at the level of mind and consciousness that then certainly do have applications to survival.
Sure. And this just brings me back to the idea of acceptation in general. And also the idea you brought up, something that we would refer to, you were talking about bacteria and a stress response being an increase of mutation rate in certain areas of the genome. We would call that facilitated variation, and talk about that as a subset of what's known as evolvability. And so we might talk about the evolution of evolvability and things like that. And there's an obvious parallel between this generation of undirected variation, but with a kind of trying to avoid the word faith, as though bacteria have faith or whatever, but with the foresight that is built into the evolvability is that if this region is just reshuffled enough, a good trick will be discovered.
Evolutionary faith, let's call it.
Well, this isn't going to be publicized, right? Yeah. I don't have to commit to that term. It's like, I mean, you actually said this in one of our earlier conversations, and it was a kind of a beautiful thing, because we were talking about the early evolution of the early cosmos, or evolution in the early cosmos, or whatever. And I was sort of insisting, but it could be undirected. We don't need telos to be built in from the beginning in order to get a universe that looks, I mean, I don't think we do. I would prefer not to feel that we need that, let's say. That's my axiology to some degree, my intuition, my values for whatever reason. But you said that it was like play. And exactly, evolution is play in some sense, right? It's generating variation arbitrarily or blindly, or for the joy of it, if you want. And again, that would apply to actual play with actual organisms that play, complex organisms. But maybe in a Whiteheadian sense, that would kind of apply to the generation of novelty, like in toto, right, across the board, that it was a joyful thing, or it was a value laden in and of itself, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I just thought all the stuff that you were saying was just making me think about, so play is a way of generating variation. Chris, we talked about this last time as well. Chris Fields talked about babbling on Kurt Mungel's podcast as a kind of general way of generating variation. And I haven't been able to get that term. I make sure to credit him every time I mention it, but haven't been able to get that term out of my head, probably especially as a new parent with got a 10-month-old daughter who is, literally babbling all the time. And, in that discussion with Mike Levin and Carl Friston, they were talking about this babbling as a generalized, an active process which generates variation. Again, in evolutionary biology, we call that facilitated variation, and there are certain characterized examples. But we're probably going to find that this is just a general term in evolutionary logic, like there's a process that generates variation, there's a process that selects. It's a very, very basic evolutionary theory that, selects a subset of the variation and propagates it. And I love the idea of play, of like literal play now, actual play, as exactly that kind of thing. And psychedelic use as a kind of play, which does exactly this, facilitates exactly this capacity to generate variation. And and I think one of the common and perspectives that has the kind of ring of truth to it about what underlies the therapeutic impact and the sort of transdiagnostic therapeutic application of, psychoplastogenic drugs, is that they, dissolve certain habitual patterns, certain ways that we've been chunking the world, perspectives we've been taking on the world. We go into a state of facilitated, now changing the terminology, but to just show the parallels, we go into a state of facilitated variation, which is play. And that enables us, when that whole thing ends, and thankfully it ends, even though it might be a beautiful, wonderful experience, thankfully we do, there's decanalizing, but there is recanalizing. Hopefully we come back to ourselves, so to speak. But we have novel perspectives, because of all that variation that's been going on. And most of it is like not going to be useful, maybe. Most of it we could probably agree is that there's a lot of distortion maybe going on there. Things are moving, which are not really, whatever's happening. But some percentage of it, we've got this novel insight that we can then, integrate, hopefully. That's the big burden, right? The responsibility after the fact, to integrate whatever novel insight we have into our lives.
Yeah. And it's not surprising that we, in our earlier conversations, end up in the conversation about play, because I think, so much of our dialogue has been an attempt to either find a place for purpose of some kind in evolution, or to describe it in an attenuated enough way that it's still more or less naturalistic. But play, is not clearly purposeful in the sense that it is, that we play as a means to some other end, right? As if we're aiming at to accomplish something other than just enjoying being in a playful situation, or engaging in play as an enjoyable end in itself, right? So it's not purposeful, it's not teleological really at all, even though it's clearly an example of, what I've been calling mentality or mind or consciousness. And so
But a great example, right, of how this and again, to your point, when we were talking about the evolution of the early cosmos, how telos and purpose can emerge from something which is not in itself directed towards any end. Its purpose is to generate variation, or its purpose is to generate, the possibility of finding purposeful things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just evolution. That's just evolutionary logic, right?
Right. We got about 5 minutes, and it's a big topic to turn to. But as human beings, I think it's inescapable that we want to plan for the future and engage in various design projects to enhance life, to alleviate suffering. And when it comes to molecules, biomolecules, there's this really this frontier that's opening largely as a result of the psychedelic renaissance, because there's so much money and research now being done, money pouring into research on the invention of novel molecules. So again, a form of maybe facilitated variation again, though this time in laboratories.
Artificial selection.
There you go, artificial selection.
Or if you want, intelligent design.
Right. So this is a brave new world, to use Huxley's title, where it's not clear to me that the purposes that will be realized as a result of this sort of research will be enhancements of human life. I mean, there will be medical applications that might relieve some suffering, but on the other hand, given the prevalence of drug addiction, I can only begin to imagine the sorts of psychedelics, nootropics, mind-altering chemicals that are going to be coming out of the laboratory in the next couple of years. Do you have any thoughts on this new development? I mean, it's not totally new, but it's just accelerating.
Well, I mean, firstly, I'm not in a rush if you want to keep going, so it's up to you. I'm not sure if you've got something on.
I need to wrap up and we can go beyond the top of the hour, but I do need to go grocery shopping.
Fair enough. Those bare necessities always intervening. Look, it is a huge subject, and certainly biodiscovery, and basically what we're talking about is modern pharmacology here. So it's not a new thing, and turning toxins into drugs. I mean, how we started toxins as tools, and then tinkering. So doing a kind of facilitated, but consciously or cognitively facilitated variation, creating drug libraries. By modifying individual residues on a molecule and those sorts of things, and seeing how that affects the functionality. I mean, that's how LSD was created, right? And that's just classic drug design and discovery. So it's certainly a very long-term process. I mean, it's something we've been doing for a long time, and something I'm directly involved in terms of looking for things in venoms and other toxic secretions that are potentially useful in this way. And there's a fascinating history of using, obviously, toxins as drugs. This took, turning a toxin into a drug, so to speak. Sometimes no modification is required. And again, we could talk about so-called ethnopharmacology, and practices of using these things like psilocybin or like cannabis or whatever for many thousands of years, and those are just big ticket items. Certainly many dozens of dozens or hundreds, I would say, and maybe even more than that, of bioactive molecules that have been functionally co-opted or exapted by humans in this way. And in the modern world, in modern pharmacological science, tinkering with the molecules to try and, minimize what might be seen as deleterious side effects, or maximize, the positive aspects that we're going for. We might be trying to make the targeting slightly more specific so that we don't have all these off-target effects of the drug, or all of that sort of thing. Lots of reasons why we might be trying to change a molecule, maybe just because we want to patent it. There's a whole ethical discussion you could have there about, patenting. I mean, you brought up the commercial incentives, but, patenting natural molecules like, I don't know, ketamine, which is, not originally a natural molecule. It now looks like it does, or something very similar occurs in nature. But, it's a racemic mixture of two enantiomers, so two molecules which are, mirror images of each other. And it's, it's a WHO listed essential medicine. It's a standard medicine, but people have recently tried to, just separate the two enantiomers and then patent, one enantiomer, the S enantiomer, as S-ketamine. And it's like, is that an ethical practice? And of course, if you separate the two enantiomers, they do have slightly different effects from each other, of course. And then, one of the things in this space of so-called trying to develop, excuse me, psychoplastogens. Not sure what's happened there.
Got you good.
Psychoplastogens, which are removing the psychedelic aspect from these drugs. So right. Conceptualizing neuroplasticity as the underlying mechanism of this transdiagnostic therapeutic effect of these drugs. So the kinds of things we were talking about, breaking down pre-established cognitive networks, etc., pathways, allowing for this facilitated variation to occur. That's requiring a lot of neuroplasticity at the neural level, obviously. One of the things that all of these psychedelics do is that they facilitate, this increased neuroplasticity. And there is a drive to, in exactly this sort of classic biodiscovery manner, drug design manner, to try and develop neuroplastogens or psychoplastogens or neuropsychoplastogens that don't have the unwanted hallucinatory side effects. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's a whole big conversation in and of itself, and this is something that I've been talking to my students about a lot, is that, just sort of conceptually, do we imagine that you can have this very, very rapid and profound boost in neuroplasticity without, significant phenomenological impact? And is it almost dualistic to imagine that you could have a similar degree of plastogenesis in the brain without having this, the hallucinations, basically? And then, of course, there's the big argument. So there's an ongoing argument between Roland Griffiths and his group, and Olson, is it? I'm having a mind blank on the other guy, the guy who's really big on, is it David Olson? Well,
sounds right, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, on this pure psychoplastogen side of things, where they're trying to develop these plastogenic drugs which don't have hallucinatory side effects. And Griffiths and Yarden are arguing that the mystical type experience itself, the phenomenology itself, is actually what is underlying the therapeutic impact of these substances. And so if you strip that out, even if it is possible, mechanistically to have, and again, I would question that assumption, but certainly you can develop some, psychoplastogens that aren't going to have as profound effects, but will they have as profound effects on plastogenesis? Well, I don't know, tough to say. But at the same time, if it's the experience itself that underlies the therapeutic effect, or at least partially underlies it, then are you going to be, neutering these substances by developing that sort of thing? And I guess your question was about, like all these novel psychedelics that might emerge. I guess that's probably unavoidable, and again has been going on for a long period of time. And sometimes because of prohibition of a particular substance, say like cannabis, you get so-called synthetic cannabinoids on the market, which end up being like a whole lot more dangerous than cannabis itself. So it becomes complex and tricky in many ways.
Yeah. And I don't want to be too flippant about it, but you brought up pharmacology and then ethnopharmacology, which is, I guess, white people do pharmacology and it's scientific, and everybody else who's not white does ethnopharmacology. But the whole push to isolate the mechanical the mechanism of action in the brain from the phenomenological or the psychological shift, the insight which people can experience during a trip, seems to me to be a function of something similar. This scientific desire to leave all of the cultural and psychological stuff to the side and just focus on the biological and chemical facts of the matter. And with the development of all these new chemicals, psychoactive chemicals, and I don't mean to, this isn't a hard and fast prohibition I'm suggesting, but it seems to me that when you're dealing with something like psilocybin or ayahuasca or cannabis, there's a history of cultural use that comes along with the molecule, and it's part of the set and setting, right? And even modern Westerners, or people in the global North or whatever, who experiment with these plant medicines that have a history of indigenous use, they're inheriting some of that cultural history, and it plays a major role in the nature of the experience. And I don't think when you're inventing a totally new molecule, and LSD is a good example of this, but even that, invented in the late 30s, over the course of decades now, has acquired its own cultural history. Massive expectation involved when someone takes LSD, even if they're not historians and don't know all the details. They know about the counterculture, or they've been affected by that whole hippie movement, etc. And so my worry is that inventing all these new molecules, assuming that they do still have some subjective effect, is that it's going to be profoundly disorienting, because just as LSD was, I guess, initially, because we don't have the cultural context within which to interpret them. And if the goal here is healing, I just wonder if a more conservative approach, working with the medicines that have millennia of history behind them, might not be the more appropriate way forward, though of course that's less profitable, I guess.
Less profitable, less easy to conceptualize in, as you say, scientific or scientistic terms, because you're bringing the psyche into the space that it's supposed to have been rigorously excluded from to some extent. And it opens up all of these difficult questions about whether or not if these are being used in psychotherapeutic circumstances in order to kind of potentiate psychotherapy, does the psychotherapist themselves need to be experienced? And if they're not, can they possibly mediate these sorts of experiences? There's a disruption. So, a term that's out there is disruptive pharmacology, and it's a fascinating term to unpack on different levels. But, it disrupts the prevailing pharmacological paradigm and pharmacotherapeutic paradigm in various ways, like If these are drugs that potentiate psychotherapy, are they potentially replacing a paradigm, a psychiatric paradigm of drugs that replace psychotherapy? So-called psychotropic medication like antidepressants and antipsychotics and things like that, and without weighing in on whether they have their place. I mean, they have their place, but it's a completely different mode where the psychiatrist can prescribe the drugs which manage symptoms and not necessarily have to enter into a really deep psychotherapeutic alliance with their patients. Whereas now, if we're bringing psychedelics into this space, the whole deal is going to be about making a profound therapeutic alliance between, therapist and patient. And that's just a completely different way of working from the way that, drugs have been used in psychotherapy or psychiatry for the last several decades. But I mean, there's so much in what you said. Yes, on the one hand, it seems like we might want to avail ourselves of these histories, but of course, they're basically, we're going to conceptualize them as us, secular Westerners are going to conceptualize them as essentially religious practices, and that's something that we have wanted to keep very separate from science. So that's a problem. They're often associated with philosophical, metaphysical, ontological commitments that we wouldn't necessarily want to entertain. I mean, I saw there was a little back and forth on Twitter just in the last few days about the, ontological status of DMT entities, for example, and people are like at each other's throats about, do they exist independent, so there's a whole can of worms there associated with, are we just going to take some of the practices? So, maybe doing ayahuasca in a group setting and mediating it in a certain way. Are we going to need to engage with the beliefs which are completely interdependent with those practices in their traditional settings? And then not only is it, it's one thing to say that would be an effective way of doing things because that's the way these things have been used for, millennia, albeit in very different contexts from the modern, whatever we're calling the world these days, globalist world or whatever. But in an era where we're also trying to come to terms with a long history of colonialist exploitation, resource and knowledge extraction, and all of this kind of stuff, cultural appropriation, and you brought up very appositely the ethnopharmacology thing, like it's we Westerners and then everyone else is the marked class, that's ethno, and we do the real pharmacology. But in a period where we are rightly trying to understand and repair or respond to the damage of a history of cultural appropriation, how do we understand psychedelics in that space? I mean, just like how do we understand meditation in that space? And big, I mean, huge questions for us to end on here. We might need to pick this up another time.
Yeah, no, totally. I realized with my term global north that actually leaves out Australia and New Zealand, even though you guys are clearly part of the West. So
we're the economic north, right? But we're not the geographic north or whatever.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, just you're reminding me of Rachel Peterson. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but she's at Harvard Divinity School and has gone on record a number of essays and interviews talking about her experience in, I think, one of the Johns Hopkins studies, Roland Griffith's study.
I know who you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, she was part of their major depression study and had a profound experience. It didn't cure her, but it did open up sort of a new vista of on life for her. But she talks about how the bad trip is actually part of the therapeutic value.
Yeah.
And the medical establishment is hesitant, maybe understandably, to allow this sort of thing because, I mean, some bad trips can be really, really bad.
I mean, it seems like a violation of the Hippocratic Oath, right?
Yeah.
Increasing the chance of iatrogenic illness and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, what if, as you're saying, what if that's the actual site of the therapeutic insight? Yeah.
And, she's got this great phrase, she describes psychedelics, she took psilocybin as an ontological insurgent.
It's nice.
I forget who came up with the term ontological shock. I think one of these researchers, maybe at Johns Hopkins. But there's this whole interesting area of what I've called the philosophical and religious implications of psychedelically occasioned mystical experience and belief change. The title of a paper I had fun writing, trying to summarize all this research. Because there are spiritual and religious theological questions that arise for a lot of people during these sessions. Is a psychiatrist or a counseling psychologist prepared to support people if they're not, ministers, or if they're themselves trying to maintain a kind of neutral, I was going to say neutral secular. I don't think secular is neutral, but where is the neutral space when you're trying to support someone through a healing process that for them personally involves mystical religious type experiences, beliefs in God or gods or something like panpsychism or DMT elves or what have you. But then the other side of this is Peterson talks about one of the more disturbing aspects of these ontological insurgents is that she says, perhaps to our horror, they demand something of us, which is to say, what's revealed to us, the psychological insights that come, they're not just gifts that we then possess. They're more like insights into what we would need to do to, gain the type of healing that we're seeking. And so that can be challenging. And often when we go to the doctor and seek medical help, mental health help, we want a pill that's going to fix us, right? We don't want to be challenged to better ourselves, not just in a health sense, but I think she's pointing out the moral dimension of this too, that we're actually being called to be better people. And that's hard to place in a scientific medical context.
Cool. And in a context where people, as you say, are very motivated to find the magic bullet. I mean, and we've seen the same thing happen, I think, with mindfulness and so-called mindfulness and all of that, And when you initially have that experience, you start a practice and you're getting really into it, and you're starting to get to half an hour every day, and you're doing it for a few weeks, and suddenly, everything is going swimmingly, and then you become an evangelist for a little while, and you're telling everybody, have you tried meditating? It's solved all my problems. And similarly with psychedelics, there's this it's very difficult for researchers, because how do they avoid becoming advocates as well if this has changed their lives? But also, how do we avoid this superficial getting caught up in the immediate afterglow of the experience, and not necessarily acknowledging? I think that article by Peterson sounds very pertinent in this area, but there's been a pushback, in say the last year or whatever, to try and ensure that this narrative about bad trips, or maybe it's more than a year. I mean, certainly Eric Davis comes to mind of, someone emphasizing the weirdness in these things. And this has to be, explicitly acknowledged, that these are going to mess with a lot of things in subtle ways. And are we prepared for that? Are we prepared for that ontological shock, which becomes a culture shock, which already kind of went a bit pear-shaped in the 60s, and how are we we need to be upfront about the thing. This is going to destabilize and disrupt a lot of things. That might be good, but we don't want to hide this. And again, we don't want to hide the possibility of bad trips. I mean, a couple of things that come to mind are, Jung on this subject, quite famously, I think someone did it on YouTube, so it's become quite famous. But in a letter he was writing to a priest, in some of his voluminous correspondence, he was asked about psychedelics, and he basically said, well, I totally believe that they would cause probably shouldn't speak French, but abaissement du niveau mental, a lowering of the boundaries, basically, or the level of consciousness, but that meaning a flood coming up from the unconsciousness. It's going to bring up all of this sort of material. But what people who are celebrating that, and this is like in the late 50s when he's talking about this, it's really even before the major, you know, countercultural stuff going on in the 60s. What people who are celebrating that are not recognizing is the responsibility that comes with from revelation. So with all this stuff is going to emerge from your unconscious. How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to process that? There's a burden that comes with that. The response, we would say integration, right? The responsibility of integrating that into your life. And Jung is basically like, yeah, you don't want that. You think you want that, but you don't want that. You get enough. Like he literally says, you get enough in like daily life or in practices of active imagination or whatever. Yeah. You know, and that's one thing for Jung to say, of course, who had like a full on, you know, we might say a psychotic episode or an extended period of time when he was writing the red, you know, the black books that became the red book and all that. He got a lot of that, but, you know, not necessarily many people are not so open to those sorts of things. And therefore maybe they need a bit of that jolt. But his point about responsibility is extremely well made and very prescient. You know, he's saying this, you know, I mean, prescient in one sense, but also the kind of thing that people in these traditions have been saying for centuries or millennia. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that you know, this made me think of in also in response to what you were saying before is that, you know, if we're adopting or trying to learn from some of these traditional, relatively ancient practices, what about the training and initiation of the therapists or the, you know, shamans in those contexts? They would have probably gone through maybe years of initiation into that world. They would have a particular understanding. Of course, they would have a particular ontology and you know, way of framing these sorts of things, but they would be highly experienced. And of course, we know in many traditions, they would sometimes be the ones taking the substance or even just doing incubation or active imagination without the aid of a substance, but they would be the ones traversing the spirit realm in order to you know, bring back the knowledge to then transfer to their community. And of course, there are all kinds of mixed practices, you know, from that to everyone in the community sort of getting on it in a you know, ritualized context or whatever. But I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned there, and certainly again, just to bring up Jung, you know, seeing those sorts of things as a model of the therapeutic alliance and how much work it takes on the part of the therapist to be able to, you know, get into the right states of consciousness, to form a relationship and be there for somebody who's potentially going through, you know, the most, you know, life-shattering experience, the ontological insurgence or shock or whatever. Can you be there for somebody while they're going through that? What kind of fortitude and experience do you have to be able to do that? And then we're now seeing, like, I get all these, just because I'm sort of slightly peripheral to this space, I get all these emails. You know, there's an organization in Australia whose name I won't mention, but obviously there are many in America and in Europe, and they're offering training for psychedelic therapists. And as with everything, I'm sure these range from like as excellent a program as you could possibly imagine through to training in countries, again, I'm not going to mention any names, but where the substances are illegal still, so you cannot get access to them, but we're going to train you without the substances being involved. So we're going to give you all this we're going to do a 2-week course. All you need to do is give us several $1,000s, and we will, in a couple of weeks, train you, you know, assuming you're already a counselor or whatever, so you already know a little bit about the Therapeutic Alliance. We'll train you in 2 weeks to become a psychedelic therapist, even though you will never even see a psychedelic substance during that. And it's like, I don't know. I have very mixed feelings about that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, likewise. And, you know, Jung was such a wise man, and I appreciate his caution in this area. That was what he died in 1963, right? So he must have been only, I mean, the psilocybin project at Harvard was shut down, and Leary and Richard Alpert were fired in 1963. So it must have been early days before the cultural chaos.
61. He died in 61.
61. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I think it was even in the late 50s. So it might have been after, Gordon Wasson's
Right,
Time
Life,
magazine
Life
article. Yeah,
magazine.
yeah, Life magazine, sorry.
Mhm.
And obviously after Doors of Perception and all of that. I mean, there was a slow, because that's 54 or whatever. So there's a slow build of the psychedelic community.
Right. But it was still
Um,
mostly the literati who were
yeah,
taking them
for
and
sure.
writing about them. It
Sure.
wasn't yet.
And Huxley was saying it should only be the literati, very elitist attitude. This was
Yeah.
great for me and my peers, but we don't want this to get out into the general public. And I mean, you can say that that's really elitist. You could also say that that was prophetic if you had a particular slant on it. No,
Yeah.
it's a super challenging space. I mean, I'm really just a biologist, and so I'm really interested. I mean, I'm super interested in all these questions, obviously, but in how do we understand these practices in this broader context where we began in terms of biology, and we didn't get into things like animal drug use, like animal recreational drug use even.
Mhm.
It's a conversation for another day perhaps, but yeah.
My dog
Yeah,
loves apples that have fallen and sort of my dog gets drunk on
yeah,
rotten apples that
they,
have fermented.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are many animals that we know like that. Even bees, right? Bees
Mm.
will preferentially forage if given the opportunity on fermented nectar, and they will drink pure ethanol in the lab, which
Mm.
is pretty full on. But they even have social practices to guard against alcoholism. Drunk bees may be denied entrance to the hive and even killed.
Oh,
So it's yeah,
that's
there's
strict.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not an elitist about these things, but as you're saying, there's a certain level of preparation and training that's required. That's not just theoretical. Even experienced psychonauts can be surprised by a particular trip, which was not what they expected or not unlike anything they had experienced before, So,
I mean,
uh,
even cannabis, which a lot of people take very lightly, it's not uncommon to hear the story about the person who used to smoke weed when they were a kid or whatever and hasn't had it for a few
mm,
years, and then it's like, oh yeah, has some weed at a party or something like that, and completely, freaks themselves out.
mhm,
These things are powerful, and they do need to be treated with respect. And I think
mhm.
the psychedelic renaissance is fascinating in so many ways because it brings up so many of these questions, and it gives us the opportunity to talk a little bit more publicly about these things than we might have only a few years ago. And that's really great. It's great to be teaching this series of lectures on human relationship with drugs in a pharmacology course at a major university.
Mm.
And obviously there's absolutely no advocacy in that space. There's just a discussion of a history and a kind of like consideration of what's going on, and it just raises so many questions. But yeah, I mean, I have this real admiration for good psychotherapists. Like, I think that they are heroic people, because I think, again, I think Jung is just a beautiful writer on this. One of his late books that people don't necessarily talk about when they talk about Jung, because everyone likes the alchemy and the more mystical stuff, but it's called The Practice of Psychotherapy, and it's
Mm.
just a beautiful discussion of that therapeutic alliance. And really, it's to speak of Jung, it's really important to understand, why did he refer to his analytical psychology as an antique philosophy? It's because he thought that, ancient philosophy, including ancient Greek philosophy, was this kind of, shamanic psychotherapeutic tradition. And again, incubation, people going and like entering into their psyches in active imagination, in hypnagogic states, in caves underground, and then you have all the death rebirth mythology imagery that's associated with all of that stuff. But he just writes so beautifully about the formation of that therapeutic alliance and kind of what it takes for the psychotherapist to, in his terms, to be able to meet the whole of the patient's psyche with the whole of their psyche. So the kind of fortitude you have to be that open and vulnerable in the presence of another person, especially as when they're being open and vulnerable, and they've probably come to you because they're suffering in some profound manner, things are going to come out that are going to be very confronting. And how are you going to be ready, to take on the responsibility that, comes with them giving you the paycheck or whatever. And I think the psychedelic renaissance brings those sorts of questions really into sharp relief for the way psychotherapy, psychiatry has been practiced in the modern Western world for the past several decades. And is your average psychotherapist or dare I say psychiatrist going to be capable of being the kind of of holding space, right, for someone who's going through these sorts of experiences? I mean, I just don't know.
Yeah. I used to be more reckless, I would say now, about imagining that psychedelics could only have a positive effect on culture and society, and
put it in the water. Is that
right?
That
As a 19-year-old, it just seemed so obvious to me that would improve things just by humbling people in power. I mean, it was really what I was imagining. But now, learning more about the ways that psychedelics were used already in the 60s and later by serial killers and the CIA's experiments, and the real danger of mind control here. Someone with ulterior motives can very easily, in a cult-like setting, use psychedelics to convince people to do really horrible things. And so in a society already so destabilized, for the psychedelic renaissance to be occurring now, I never would have expected it to be occurring when, 10, 15, 20 years ago, when I was first getting into this stuff, learning about the history. But here we are. Society is and politics and geopolitics are in such a tailspin, and psychedelics are coming onto the scene. And so I'm very nervous. I'm very nervous about the mix of all these trajectories. But
that's probably the right response, because you need that justified, it's reverence, respect, reverence, awareness of the awesomeness, in some sort of literal sense, of the experiences that these sorts of things can occasion, and that just unleashing that in a society which doesn't have the containers for it, which doesn't have the history, and which, how much does stigma, I mean, this is a huge discussion about drug use in general. So like we talked a tiny bit about addiction before, but how much does societal stigma of the use of certain, drugs that are not sanctioned by the mainstream actually contribute to patterns of compulsive use and things like that? But with psychedelics, how much does a history of stigma affect the set, the mindset of people doing these sorts of things? I mean, so many subtle and interesting questions there. So it opens up the playing field for a lot of deep consideration, and that's coming into conflict with, of course, people who are very impatient for this to become widely available, and not without reason. Again, people are really quite desperate for the magic bullet, but for something that's helpful. And it does seem like these things can be helpful, but there are lots of competing tensions here. And we really, I guess, we need the cultural containers. We need the education about drugs in general. That's part of what these lecture series are about, these Drugs That Shape Society course that I'm lecturing in. And the way I approach this idea of the human relationship with drugs, we really need to change our understanding of, even just at a very basic level, what is a drug? So, I start like my lectures by saying that, I've got my cup of drugs here, like there's caffeine and theobromine. This is a mocha, there's caffeine and theobromine in here. And drug use is completely ubiquitous in our society, just as it's been ubiquitous in pretty much every human society that we're aware of. It's just different drugs. We have a different stance towards certain drugs, and we don't even necessarily consider them drugs. There's a fascinating essay by Derrida on drugs that, actually wrote about drugs a lot, but a really interesting one in which he kind of argues that alcohol and nicotine and caffeine aren't drugs. And I know what he means, but that's exactly the kind of thing that I'm always trying to counter, right? I'm always trying to point out, like, you barely know anybody, average member of modern Western society, you barely know anybody that is not a habitual drug user. Even if it's just that when they have a headache, they take drugs. But most people drink coffee or tea or hot chocolate, and often regularly. And a lot of people are drinkers, obviously, and blah, blah, blah. And how does the way we do have containers for certain kinds of drugs affect both the set and setting for users of both those drugs and any drug that is not sanctioned? And, this idea that when you were 19, you were very, evangelizing about psychedelics or whatever. And it's very common, or it could have been about cannabis or whatever. And as you get older, maybe if you're a deep thinker or you're considering these sorts of things, you are starting to understand the risks. Maybe you've even had personal challenges, or you've seen friends and family have personal challenges with some of these substances, and you're realizing that, drugs aren't good or bad intrinsically. It's always context dependent what they're doing and all of that kind of stuff. But just the fact that you're inclined towards a certain kind of evangelism is itself a product of the lack of nuance in the way culturally we respond to almost to drugs in general, because it's almost like, well, those things we accept we are kind of not drugs, or whatever, or you're just being technical or being pedantic when you say that they are drugs. But that thing, this other substance, never mind if it's cannabis. And I mean, you're in a different situation from me, of course, in the sense that cannabis is legal in your state. But and of course, things have changed a lot, in the US in particular, but worldwide in terms of cannabis, and that's largely a good thing. But the way family members or friends would react to someone's cannabis use versus the way, recreational, not necessarily massive abuse, but in comparison to the way they might react to the alcohol. So you might almost be excluded from, family social functions or whatever for not drinking. Oh, no, I don't drink. Oh, what's wrong with you? You got a problem with alcohol? Or
Right.
As opposed to, if you were just to randomly light up a spliff in those sorts of situations, you would probably be vilified in many families, not even necessarily the most conservative families. So all of these things have an impact on the actual effect that drugs have on us and the relationships that we enter into them. And then, there's just so much work to be done, philosophical work to be done, thinking about all of these different issues. And the psychedelic renaissance, as well as the legalization of cannabis and whatever, brings that stuff to people.
Yeah, I mean, there's the science is interesting, the politics are interesting. I think it's been amazing to see how quickly in the US, especially in California, but many states have legalized cannabis now, that culture is evolving, and looking at some of the polling on this and how people feel about alcohol and its dangers versus cannabis and its dangers. And there's a little bit, maybe too much of a lackadaisical attitude about cannabis, particularly with the developing brain of children and teenagers. I think we need to be a bit more cautious. 21 is probably a good age, which is where it's set now. I think that makes sense. But keeping that in mind, that, we want to make sure that we have reasonable age restrictions on these things. I think it's really a cognitive liberty issue. If something as dangerous as alcohol is legal, and you only need to be 18 to drink, 21 to drink also. You only need to be 18 to go to war, but 21 to drink. Meanwhile, cannabis and the standard psychedelics are Schedule I substances. I think there's no scientific basis, and I think it's a cognitive liberty issue. Ultimately, is the way I would frame it, and that we have a right to explore our own consciousness, and adults have a right to explore their own consciousness. Especially in the case where medically we know there's very little physiological risk involved in these substances, especially relative to things that are already legal, like, tobacco and alcohol. So hopefully the trend will continue in that direction, even while I do think we need to be cautious and not overzealous about, proselytizing about these things, because there are still risks, right? So
I mean, one of the things, of course, which you would be all over, but understanding the history, it's a kind of an evolutionary question again, deconstructing the evolutionary history of the norms and the laws that we have surrounding different drugs, and why this drug has, at least coming up with a perspective on why this drug is illegal or vilified and this one is, sanctioned. And I think we're doing a lot of that culturally these days, and it's fascinating to watch, because like you, it's something I've been interested in for much of my life, and it's fascinating to see these things being more mainstreamed now. And again, being able to lecture on this kind of stuff and talk about the impact and acceptance of caffeine in Europe, as opposed to the impact and lack of acceptance of some of these other substances perhaps. But it's also a really interesting thing, because there's we talk about the psychological versus the physical effects of these sorts of things, and there's a kind of false dichotomy, but there's a pragmatic distinction to be made there perhaps. And maybe, and I know you would agree with this, but maybe only focusing on the toxicity, like the physiological consequences. Alcohol is far more toxic than psilocybin, sure, obviously, but focusing only on that to the exclusion of the psychological consequences of both drugs, because there are obviously major psychological consequences associated with alcohol use, both acutely in terms of like increased rates of violence and etc. Some crazy amount of murders in the US are committed under the influence of alcohol, which doesn't mean, again, that alcohol causes people to become murderous, all these complex issues. But as when an start to say, oh, well, look, alcohol is so much more toxic than psilocybin, so psilocybin should just be legal, that would also be an unsophisticated and premature way of responding to it, right? I do agree with you. I'm not pushing back against the sort of cognitive liberty aspect. I think that that's absolutely right. But I think that, again, to the all we've been discussing, we want to make it as safe as possible. It shouldn't really be a legal issue. It's a cultural issue. We need to create these containers. We need to have much better education. We need to ensure that the positive aspects of these things, which are very real, are maximized, and that we have an understanding of the possible negative aspects, so that their impact can be mitigated, and people who need support can be given support, and all of that. But it should be primarily a legal issue, which is such a blunt instrument.
Yeah, totally. And earlier you were mentioning, and I think I need to go grocery shopping at this point. It's just been too much fun to leave this conversation. But you're mentioning Derrida and his essay on drugs. I forget what the title was, Plato's Pharmacy or something like that.
Yeah, there's Plato's Pharmacy. That's not the one I'm thinking of. I'm actually thinking of an interview. So Plato's Pharmacy is fantastic. And that's something I do. It's been a great joy to be able to talk about Derrida to pharmacology students. So I talk about all of the different definitions of the root, pharmacon, pharmakeia, all of that kind of stuff, and that's super fascinating, because just the etymology and use of the word drug, pharmacy, etc. That's just a fascinating thing to delve into. I cannot remember the name of this interview, but it would actually be worth us even having both reading it and doing a chat. Having perhaps a chat specifically about this interview, because it's really, really fascinating, the things that he goes into. But
no, he always is. But I just thought of Plato and the Phaedo, the Phaedrus, the dialogue where Socrates goes on a walk with this guy Phaedrus to talk about a speech that he heard, and Phaedrus pulls out the written version of it, and Socrates basically goes on this diatribe against writing as a drug because of its mind altering, not enhancing, but degrading effects, in the sense that it degrades memory, and someone can sort of fake rhetorical skill by using a written speech as a kind of crutch. And nowadays we're so literate. I mean, even illiterate people are literate in their consciousness, because they've been shaped by this alphabetic culture.
This is the basic Derridian point, right? As
Right.
well.
Right. Yeah. So drugs are everywhere, and not just, or they're not just intrinsic to human existence, but as you're pointing out earlier, I mean, animals as well alter their consciousness in various ways. So
yeah. Can I just really quickly finish
sure.
just on the Derrida thing?
Yeah.
Because speaking of relying on the written word to make oneself sound smarter, I brought up my slide. I just found my slide on this particular thing. One of the things that I really love about it is, he describes the meaning of, pharmacon and in various derived terms as having this double contradictory undecidable value that always derives from syntax. So from its context, and I mean, of course, he will draw the kind of obvious, or certainly obvious in hindsight, conclusion that all words have only a context specific meaning, right? And I use that as another way of getting into this discussion of the context specificity of drugs, and the way that the impact of a drug is very much derived from context. But this is not just a psychological thing. This is not just a set and setting thing. This, to go all the way back to the beginning, is about the context specificity of toxicity. Toxicity, I describe it as a context specific property. It's derived from a particular context. I mean, we could quote famous, it's traditional to quote Paracelsus, the dose makes the poison. Dose is one aspect, or concentration is one aspect that is context specific. But we could get into the molecular weeds, but we don't have time. But there are so many different things going on in these ecological interactions now between one organism making a bioactive molecule and another organism receiving that bioactive molecule, and depending on so many things about the receiving organism and about the delivering organism, like what are the concentrations that are delivered, all these sorts of things, what are the targets like in the different everything affects and modulates the effect of these sorts of things. And just on the Derrida thing again, like he goes into so many different things, Pharmakeia, the nymph who's playing and distracted and then gets carried away by the north wind or goes over the edge of the cliff. So drugs distract you unto death. Pharmakeia is, poisons and drugs, right? Like Socrates is lured off the path, right? He's lured to outside the polis where he normally never go, all of this kind of stuff, which is drugs taking you off the normal path of life and taking you out into the wilderness and destabilizing you. A scapegoat, pharmakos, that's the human sacrifice during the Targalia, the festival of Apollo, right? It's the scapegoat, so very Girardian. But drugs as a scapegoat, I mean, that's a huge way that we conceptualize these things. It's not that there were other problems with my child's upbringing. It's that they got into the drug at a certain point and they were completely off the rails. And, if only there was a harsher drug policy, then my child would never, all of that kind of stuff that the rhetoric of the drug war really plays on, that scapegoat mentality, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot we could unpack from the Derrida essays, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm just so tempted to go into Derrida on just inheriting Saussure's structuralism and understanding of a binary relationship among signs, and versus Peirce's triadic understanding, which sort of breaks us out of the linguistic solipsism that some would maybe caricature Derrida as getting us stuck into, even though I know Derrida's written on Peirce. But I need to explore that material more to see where he goes with that. Peirce seems to me to be way more pointing us in the direction of a kind of semiosphere, biosemiotic, environment where meaning is not just about human language, human signs pointing to other signs and gaining their meaning from the context within that linguistic system, but rather, there are these other forms of meaning, iconicity, and the ways in which meaning is produced beyond just arbitrary symbols, let's say, which seems to me to be where Derrida does most of his interesting work. But I'm not a Derrida scholar, so we'll save that for next time when I can do my homework first.
Yeah, I think it would be a great chat to continue the drug chat maybe, or the talking about drugs. The drug chat, I'm not sure what that might be, but and we could use Derrida as a jumping off point there, and lots to delve into there. And of course, I mean, in terms of biosemiotics, that is how one of the ways that Peirce has been appropriated. And again, I think that can easily take us back to just the context specificity of everything in biology, of especially traits that are ecological, that explicitly mediate interactions between organisms. So the effect on one organism is always different from another. But then any functional trait works in one context, doesn't necessarily work in another context. If you're a highly I often use the example of a koala or something. If you're a highly specialized eucalyptus leaf eater, if all of the, that could be a very successful strategy when there's a lot of, in the context of eucalyptus forest. But if there's no eucalyptus forest, suddenly this is a pathological trait. It's maladaptive now. And then that, in our usual fashion, that could take us back to relationism, and basically like there's nothing that is not formed from a context-dependent relation. There are no intrinsic, properties or essences in that sense.
Right. Yeah. A chain of nucleic acids outside the context of a living cell doesn't code for or mean anything, right?
Exactly.
So it's totally dependent on that context.
But meaning in particular is a great example of something that's context dependent. But I think that's it's easily generalizable in biology to all functions, and indeed properties like toxicity. Toxicity is not a function necessarily. And I mean, that's easily illustrated by a lot of the sort of non-biological, even though they're human, toxins. Things under your kitchen sink are toxic, but they're not, that's just a property that they have. It's not functional. They're not intended to be toxic,
Right. It's a relational property, we might say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, good stuff. This was fun. Thanks, Tim.
Pleasure always, Tim.
Until next time.
Sorry for keeping you from your groceries, Phil.
No, it was really really a pleasure, and we'll just be eating dinner a little bit later today. That's fine.